This is a red letter day because I've been writing a new book. And so I'm going to talk about the first parts of that book. And first I thought I'd just tell you what it's all about. So I thought, in this time of the coronavirus, what I realized is that so many people out there in the big bad world really don't understand and never had been exposed to immunology before. The good news is that everybody's learning immunology on the news every day, and that's very, very good. But what I thought, and I started this way back maybe a year or two ago, I thought that what I could do, what I might be able to do to satisfy my urge to educate the world is to write a book for the general public about what immunology is. And the way I decided to do that was to write a memoir focused on my career as an immunologist. And in that instance, then I hope to explain and to illustrate, what science is really all about, who does it, what's it like to be a scientist, how do you become a scientist? And then really, because I'm an immunologist, the science that we're going to be dealing with in this book is immunology. And hopefully, as I march through my career in this memoir, you'll get a flavor of what it's like to become and be an immunologist. And so I thought we'd start with just the prologue. I haven't written the introduction yet, because I usually don't write an introduction until I'm done with the whole book. And I'm not quite done yet, but I'm, like 7/8 there, maybe just a couple of more chapters. And so I'm going to start with the prologue of this book. And the prologue opens with me walking into the laboratory one morning, and I got this phone call from a fellow by the name of Steven Rosenberg. Now, I knew Steve Rosenberg. He's the head of the surgery branch of the National Cancer Institute down in Bethesda. So I said, "So what are you all about this morning?" I usually don't get phone calls from Steve Rosenberg day in and day out. So he told me that he'd heard that we had a method to really increase the production of T-cell growth factor like 100-fold. And I said, yeah, that was true. We have a cell line, it's a leukemia cell line that makes about 100-fold higher concentration of T-cell growth factor when stimulated with the various agents that we use than do normal T-cells, normal lymphocytes. And he basically, he listened to me for a while, and then he interrupted me and he said, "But you don't understand. We're curing cancer down here." And I said, well, I was a little bit taken aback about that. Well, he went on to say, as a consequence, he needs T-cell growth factor in barrels. He needs a lot of T-cell growth factor. And he sort of ordered me to produce the T-cell growth factor and send it down to him. And I said, well, Steve, we're busy up here. We've got all kinds of projects that we're trying to accomplish and so forth. And I think that's preposterous. And I think you've got so much chutzpah, you don't know what you're dealing with. And so we hung up the phone, and that was the end of that conversation. What T-cell growth factor is, and of course we're going to learn a lot more about it in this book, the origins of T-cell growth factor go back to 1965, when there were two papers that came out in Nature, which is one of the most prestigious scientific journals, comes out weekly. One of my good buddies in the business used to call it a semi-scientific weekly science magazine, because he was a hardcore chemist, and he sort of looked down his nose at what the kind of stuff that they were publishing in Nature. But anyway, Nature published these two papers in 1965. They were both from McGill University in Canada. They both basically said the same thing, and that was if you took white blood cells from people by drawing blood and then separating out the red blood cells and so forth. And if you then took those cells and you put them into culture flasks and so forth and stimulated them, and then waited a few days and then harvested the cells, centrifuged the cells down, and take the supernatant, the liquid on top of the cells, throw the cells away, take the supernatant and use that on a fresh batch of cells, that you could get that fresh batch of cells to proliferate. That was interesting because, at that time, in the late for example, in the late 50s, like 1958, for example, lymphocytes were described as sort of boring end-stage cells. Nobody really knew what they did, and nobody was really interested in them. Well, it turns out that there are several different kinds of white blood cells, lymphocytes being one of them. As time went on after that discovery in 1965 in publications in Nature, lymphocytes became a very, very hot item because people realized then in the early 60s and then thereafter that these were the cells that mediated immunity. And immunity is a word that actually goes back to the Latin, whereby it was used to designate people in the Roman times who were immune, meant that they were exempt from military service, which was a good thing because you could get killed in the Roman army. And because it's exactly what happens when you become immune to an infectious disease or some other kind of insult into your body fights it off. And then the question became, or has become, how does it do that? That's what immunology is all about. So that was 1965. And then between 1965 and 1975, in that decade that occurred during that time, there were several publications. Actually, nothing happened between 1965 and 1970. And then between 70 and 75, there were a series of publications that came out from different laboratories from all over the world. There are at least a half a dozen of them. And they basically said the same thing that these two original papers from 1965 had shown. And actually, I have a picture of one of the investigators from 1965, then, because he was Japanese, and I actually visited him over in Japan. And I have a picture of him together with my teenage son, because we were on a little reconnaissance tour of Japan at that particular point in time. His name was Shinpei Kasakura. Kasakura was a good guy. I really liked him. So there were several reports that basically repeated Kasakura's work, but they didn't really extend it and didn't make it go any further. Until 1976, there was a very, very important report from a person by the name of Doris Morgan, together with a fellow by the name of Frank Rossetti, from Bob Gallo's laboratory from the National Cancer Institute, another lab like Rosenberg's, but a different place. And what they found was that if they made this conditioned medium like Kasakura had instructed, and then if they put they put bone marrow cells, because they were trying to grow leukemia cells. If they put the bone marrow cells from leukemic patients into this so-called, what they call it, lymphocyte conditioned medium, and then if they watched it carefully and if they kept the cells at a very, very low concentration, that ultimately those cells would begin to proliferate, and they would continue to proliferate, and they were able to keep these cells growing for as long as 13 weeks. And that was unheard of, because prior to that, people could only get cells to grow for 3 or 4 days, and then they would peter out, and then they would die. So they didn't know what they had there. They tried to find out whether or not they had leukemia cells growing, but they didn't have leukemia cells growing, and that was a bummer for them because that's what they were trying to do. Turns out, though, that they were growing lymphocytes, and they looked like leukemic lymphocytes, but they weren't leukemic. They were normal. And beyond that, they also found, when they did various numbers of tests to try to characterize these cells as to exactly what they were, that they looked like they were T cells. Now, a T cell is a lymphocyte that comes out of the bone marrow from the precursor cells and travels to the thymus. And the thymus is a gland in the upper chest, big collection of lymphocytes. That's where T cells learn to become T cells. What they do is they go from the bone marrow, they're immature. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to do anything. They go to the thymus and they reside in the thymus for a while, and they become educated. And in the educational process, they mature. It's sort of like growing up if you're a kid and you become a teenager and so forth. And then finally, when you get old enough, you're allowed to, and you're actually pushed out into the world and made to go your own way. And that's what happens to T cells. And so the thing about T cells that intrigued people at the time back there in the 60s and in the 70s is that they looked like they were part of the immune system, but they didn't make any antibodies. And antibodies were made by other lymphocytes that we call B cells, because they also originate in the bone marrow. But the B cells are specialized cells too, just like the T cells. But they are, when they recognize that something is foreign in the body, and they can become stimulated by that foreign molecule or particle or whatever it is, and they then differentiate into what we call plasma cells. And plasma cells are huge factories to make antibodies. And antibodies are the molecules that they produce. They excrete it into the outside of their cell body, and it gets taken up into the bloodstream and the lymphatics, and it goes all over the body. And that really forms one of the first lines of defense against invading microbes and other kinds of things. But T cells didn't make antibodies. And that was a crazy, strange thing. I mean, how can you become a member of the immune system if you don't make antibodies? And that was the beginning then of a series of experiments that went on and are still going on in terms of trying to understand what T cells are, what motivates them, how they behave, and when they behave, how they go about doing it, and so forth. And that whole process is what this book is going to be about. Because it turns out that you can't understand those kinds of questions in terms of how do the T cells do whatever they do without getting down to the nitty-gritty of the molecules that T cells make and utilize and produce and do all the things that they're going to do. So my lab, about the same time that the Morgan report came out in terms of these long-term growing T cells, we thought that this was a very interesting paper, because at the time, we had been working for a couple of years already on taking T cells from mice and immunizing the mice with leukemia cells from that mouse strain or other mouse strains. And then we'd immunize them a couple of times, give them an initial vaccination and then give them a booster shot with the leukemia cells. And then after, we'd wait a while, a couple of 3 weeks, a month or so. Then we would take those mice and we'd kill them, and we'd take the lymphocytes from those mice, usually from the spleen. The spleen's a big organ in the upper left side of your body that is essentially a great big collection of lymphocytes as well. So we take the spleens out, and we would then take those cells and put them into tissue cultures and add the same leukemia cells that we'd already used to immunize them while they were alive. And we would wait a couple of days, a day or two or three, and then harvest the lymphocytes. By this time, we irradiated the leukemia cells with X-rays so that they wouldn't take over the culture. Otherwise, they would just grow out the top. So we irradiated the leukemia cells and hoped, we didn't know whether this was going to work or not, but we hoped that that the lymphocytes from the spleens would recognize those leukemia cells and become what we thought was what we called activated. And if they were activated, then we hoped that they would begin to proliferate, because that's what happens to other microbial products that are loosely called antigens by the immunologists. Anything that activates the lymphocytes to either make antibodies or activate the T cells is an antigen. And so we were using the leukemia cells with the hypothesis or the assumption that they were leukemia-specific antigens that the lymphocytes would recognize, and they would become activated, they'd begin to proliferate. And then what we thought what we could do is, well, we could, you know, just like everybody else, we can only get them to grow for 2 or 3 days. So we thought, well, let's use this neat stuff, this lymphocyte conditioned medium, and we'll stick that in, and then the cells will grow forever. And then we can grow up huge quantities of these cells. And because they recognize leukemia cells, we might be able to use those T cells to treat leukemias. Because what we were able to show in our initial experiments is that these lymphocytes, the T cells, would become cytotoxic for the leukemia cells. They would kill the leukemia cells in the test tube. And we could devise several different kinds of ways to show that. So now we figured we'd have a way to grow up huge quantities of tumor-specific cytotoxic T lymphocytes. And you know what? Lo and behold, it worked. It worked the first time. And it was one of those eureka moments in the laboratory because after they grew, you know, after they grew at least a week, we were really hopeful. And then we could get them to grow 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks, and then it just kept on going. And we kept saying, well, are they really T cells? Are they still cytotoxic? So we kept on growing them, and we'd harvest some every now and then, and we'd test them for killing activity. And they kept on doing it. And then we did another. Well, and so we named these cells CTLL for cytotoxic T lymphocyte lines. It was a line because it was growing continuously. And this was unheard of in biology, because the dogma in all of biology was that cells had a limited lifespan, and they could only replicate. Any kind of cell taken out of the body and put into tissue culture would only replicate 50 times was the magic number. And then it would die. That was then what distinguished a normal cell that could only replicate 50 times from a cancer cell, from a malignant cell that could replicate forever and ever and ever and ever. People had cultures of these kinds of cells. I think the most famous one is the so-called HeLa cell that was one of the very, very first, established from a lady by the name of Helen Lane, who had cervical cancer back in the 1950s. And so those cells and they've been passed all over the world, and they've been growing ever since the 1950s and so forth. But normal cells wouldn't do that. So the very fact that we could grow these cytotoxic T lymphocyte lines, and that they would maintain their cytotoxicity, that was huge. That was huge. Nobody had ever done that before. So we wrote up a manuscript, a short one, and we sent it off to Nature. Nature being, you know, one of those semi-scientific weeklies. And and we were all happy about that and so forth. And when we got it back almost a week later, and it's like a return post, rejected. Couldn't believe it. Could not believe it. So we said, so I was, you know, I was probably I was young, not as old as I am now. And so I was very brash at that time. I've subsequently mellowed out, you can tell. And so I sat down and wrote a letter, one-pager, wrote a letter, and I explained to these people, you know, what this was, because it was so new. The problem was, and the reason that they had rejected it was that they'd never heard of anything like this before. And they never heard of me, because I was a young scientist from Dartmouth. Nobody had ever heard of Dartmouth in the immunological community, because it was a small college up in New Hampshire, and there weren't any immunologists up there. So they rejected it, and I said that I tried to very scholarly explain to them that this was a whole new phenomenon, and I explained the difference between what we had found versus what Doris Morgan had reported. They were able to grow T cells, but those T cells wouldn't do anything. They looked like T cells, they behaved like T cells, but they wouldn't kill, they didn't do anything like T cells. So our cells were antigen-specific, cytotoxic T cells against a tumor antigen, which was the second discovery, because tumor antigens then and even now are still sort of suspect whether they really exist or not. We were careful to select a leukemia cells that had been activated by tumor viruses, and so we knew that they would have viral antigens on them, and that would help us at least get a little bit further down the line. So I wrote this letter, and I said, you got to send this out for review, because I knew that they hadn't sent it out for review. And the thing is that at that time, Nature and also Science, they didn't have an editorial review board of scientists. They had scientific journalists. These were people who, were basically scientists. They'd been trained, they'd gotten their PhDs in different fields and so forth. But they had elected not to play the game of science, but rather to get into journalism. And so they were making decisions on triaging these papers as to whether or not they got rejected out of hand or whether or not they got sent out for review by scientists, working scientists and so forth. And so, so I knew what was going on, but I was hoping that I could convince them that this was really an important thing. And, lo and behold again, they sent it out for review. The reviewers agreed with us. It was accepted and it was published. And this is also very important in terms of my personal history, because it was published on Bastille Day in 1977, July 14th, which was when the French Revolution started and they stormed the Bastille. And I thought that was really, really interesting, because of the fact that I knew that this was going to be a revolution in T-cell biology and T-cell immunology. And that proved to be the case. And I will stop there.